A lone figure in the night. Sheriff Joe Anderson was no stranger to the darkness. After years of patrolling the night shifts in Lakewood, he'd come to understand every shadow, every flicker of light that illuminated the quiet town. In a way, the darkness had become his sanctuary, a place where he could keep his thoughts silent and his memories at bay. But tonight, something unusual pulled him from the comfort of that stillness, disturbing the ordinary flow of his routine. The 24-hour laundromat stood along Lakewood's main street, a fluorescent oasis against the night. It wasn't unusual to see a late-night visitor, a few customers who were either too busy during the day or found themselves with nowhere else to go. But Sheriff Anderson had noticed something unusual over the past week. Every night, just as he was making his rounds, a young girl appeared at the laundromat. She was no more than 10 or 11 years old, with deep brown skin and curly hair that was often tied in two thick braids. She wore the same coat every night, a pale yellow jacket, slightly too large for her frame, and carried a small, worn-out backpack slung over her shoulder. She moved quietly, as if careful not to draw attention to herself, and each night, Joe watched as she disappeared into the laundromat and settled herself in a corner with a load of clothes. At first, Joe had reasoned that she was probably there with a parent who worked night shifts and used the laundromat as a stop on their way home. But as the nights passed and he continued to see her alone, he couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling that settled in his chest. She always came in alone, and no one else seemed to enter the laundromat after her. On the fifth night, Joe decided to investigate. He parked his cruiser just outside the laundromat, turning off the headlights to remain unnoticed. Through the large glass windows, he could see the girl seated by one of the machines, waiting patiently as her laundry tumbled within the drum. She had her knees drawn up to her chest and was leaning her head against them, her eyes half closed as if exhausted. Joe watched, unable to shake the resemblance she held to his own daughter, Clara, who would have been about her age if she were still alive. He hadn't allowed himself to think about Clara for years. The pain had been too much to bear. But tonight, the memory slipped through the cracks in his heart, and he felt a pang of longing and sorrow, mingled with a sense of duty. As he continued to observe, he noticed details he'd missed before: the faded patches on the girl's coat, the worn soles of her sneakers, and the way she glanced nervously at the door every few minutes. Something was definitely wrong, he thought. This wasn't the typical late-night errand or chore. This child was there for a reason he couldn't fathom but needed to uncover. At last, Joe made up his mind. He straightened his hat, tucked his badge more prominently into place, and stepped out of his patrol car. The fluorescent light above the laundromat flickered, casting a dull yellowish hue as he opened the door. Inside, the scent of fabric softener and the steady hum of the machines filled the air. He cleared his throat softly, not wanting to startle the girl, and made his way over to her corner. She looked up, startled, her large eyes widening as she clutched a small frayed blanket that was resting on her lap. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. Joe, with the quiet concern of a man whose heart had broken one too many times, and the girl, with a guarded wariness that was far beyond her years. "Hey there," he said softly, crouching down to meet her gaze. "I'm Sheriff Anderson. Mind if I sit with you for a minute?" The girl didn't say anything, but her eyes flicked to the badge on his chest and then back to his face. Joe gave her a reassuring smile, hoping to ease the fear he saw lingering in her expression. He waited a moment, then carefully lowered himself onto the bench beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. "What's your name?" he asked gently. The girl hesitated, her fingers twisting nervously around the edge of her blanket. After a moment, she whispered, "Ava." Joe nodded, his voice soft. "Nice to meet you, Ava. You know, I've seen you here a few nights now. You've got a good habit of keeping this place tidy." A faint smile flickered across her lips before quickly disappearing. She looked away, focusing intently on the washing machine, as if it held the answers to questions she couldn't voice. Joe sensed the walls she'd put up around herself, walls that no child should need, built from worry and weariness. "Ava," he said, keeping his tone light, "are you here alone?" She hesitated, then gave a small nod, her eyes still fixed on the spinning clothes. Joe felt a pang of sadness for this quiet, cautious child, alone in the world in ways he couldn't yet understand. He shifted slightly, trying to find the right words. "Do you have someone who knows you're here? Maybe a parent or a relative?" She shook her head, her voice barely audible. "It's just me. I don't have anyone else." Joe felt his heart tighten. He didn't press her further, sensing that she wouldn't respond well to questions. Instead, he sat with her in silence, offering his presence as a gesture of safety. In time, he hoped she'd open up and share whatever had brought her to this laundromat. Night after night, as they sat together, Joe found himself wondering about the life that had led Ava to these midnight visits, alone and unguarded. He didn't yet know her story, but he knew he would find out. He had a responsibility, not just as a sheriff, but as a man who understood what it meant to lose something precious. And as he watched Ava sit there, so small and fragile in the glow of the laundromat's lights, Joe made a silent promise to himself. He would find out the truth, protect this child, and perhaps find a way to bring her a little bit of peace in a world that had clearly taken so much from her. In that stillness, he felt the first stirrings of something he hadn't felt in a long time. A sense of purpose, a calling that went beyond his nightly patrols. As dawn approached, Joe finally left the laundromat, his mind filled with thoughts of the little girl and a determination that had been missing from his life for far too long. But the journey had only just begun. She hesitated, then gave a small nod, her eyes still fixed on the spinning clothes. Joe felt a pang of sadness for this quiet, cautious child, alone in the world in ways he couldn't yet understand. He shifted slightly, trying to find the right words. "Do you have someone who knows you're here? Maybe a parent or a relative?" She shook her head, her voice barely audible. "It's just me. I don't have anyone else." Joe felt his heart tighten. He didn't press her further, sensing that she wouldn't respond well to questions. Instead, he sat with her in silence, offering his presence as a gesture of safety. In time, he hoped she'd open up and share whatever had brought her to this laundromat, night after night. As they sat together, Joe found himself wondering about the life that had led Ava to these midnight visits, alone and unguarded. He didn't yet know her story, but he knew he would find out. He had a responsibility, not just as a sheriff, but as a man who understood what it meant to lose something precious. And as he watched Ava sit there, so small and fragile in the glow of the laundromat's lights, Joe made a silent promise to himself. He would find out the truth, protect this child, and perhaps find a way to bring her a little bit of peace in a world that had clearly taken so much from her. In that stillness, he felt the first stirrings of something he hadn't felt in a long time. A sense of purpose, a calling that went beyond his nightly patrols. As dawn approached, Joe finally left the laundromat, his mind filled with thoughts of the little girl and a determination that had been missing from his life for far too long. But the journey had only just begun. With a sigh, Tom opened the glove compartment and took out his notebook. He decided it was time to start documenting his observations. He began to write, describing each night he'd seen Imani, each detail that had caught his eye. As he wrote, he could feel the cold edge of the pen against his hand, grounding him in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. His words spilled out faster, and the unease that had gripped him seemed to clarify as he put ink to paper. Midnight. The laundromat is nearly empty, only Imani and a few machines humming along. I don't know why she's here, but it doesn't feel right. She seems almost trapped. There's a heaviness in her eyes, something that tells me she's carrying a burden no child should have. When he looked up, he realized almost an hour had passed. Imani was still inside, sitting quietly on a plastic chair as the last machine spun to a stop. Tom watched as she rose, gathered her clothes, and meticulously folded them. She packed them into a small, tattered backpack, the seams worn and edges frayed. He found himself wondering what she held onto besides those clothes. Did she have a family waiting for her? Friends, hopes and dreams that flickered in the corners of her mind. The girl finished and began making her way toward the door, the bell ringing softly as she stepped out. Tom sat up, intending to follow, but something in her demeanor stopped him. She didn't look in his direction. Instead, her gaze was fixed ahead, intense and purposeful, her steps quick but cautious. Not wanting to scare her, Tom waited until she rounded the corner before slowly starting his car. The headlights cut through the dark street, illuminating patches of crumbling pavement and glistening puddles from a recent rain. He maintained a respectful distance, keeping her in sight while giving her enough space to feel unobserved. She led him through quiet streets, each one seeming emptier and darker than the last. He noticed something peculiar. There was no distinct path she followed, no clear destination. She weaved through alleys, crossed streets at random, and every few minutes she would pause and look back, as if checking for a follower. Tom's heart sank, realizing she was on high alert, almost as if she were hiding from someone, or everyone. After a winding route that led him closer to the outskirts of town, Tom watched as Imani stopped at a rundown apartment building. It was barely maintained, the walls chipped, windows dark, and only 1 or 2 units showing signs of occupancy. She slipped inside, and the door closed behind her with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the otherwise silent night. Tom felt a surge of relief, knowing she had at least made it home, yet his concern only deepened. This part of town was known for its high turnover of residents, a transient place for those on the fringes, often avoiding any sort of official records or contact. He couldn't shake the impression that she was far too alone, navigating this life without the support a child should have. He sat in his car, the engine idling as he weighed his options. He wanted to march up to the building and knock on every door, demanding answers. But he knew that wasn't the right approach, not if he wanted to gain Imani's trust. He took out his notebook and jotted down the address, vowing to return during the day and make a few inquiries. As he made his way back to the station, his mind buzzed with more questions. What circumstances could force a young girl to live like this, roaming the town in the dead of night, managing her laundry like an adult? It was as if she were caught in a strange in-between, not quite a child, yet not fully grown. Back at his office, he stayed up, combing through the town's social services records and speaking to a few contacts he had in the community. But his search came up empty. No family, no records, no mentions of anyone that fit Imani's description. The next night, his worry reached a tipping point. He parked his patrol car across the laundromat again, and like clockwork, Imani appeared. But tonight, something was different. There was a tension in her body, a nervousness that hadn't been there before. She glanced over her shoulder frequently, and he noticed her pace was quicker. As she entered the laundromat, she cast a quick look in his direction, her face etched with a mixture of fear and desperation. She seemed to know he was watching her, but she wasn't afraid. She was silently asking him for something, though he couldn't quite place what it was. Unable to ignore the sense of urgency, Tom stepped out of his car and entered the laundromat. The bell chimed, and Imani looked up, her eyes meeting his. There was a pause, a flicker of connection between them, as if they were the only 2 people in the world at that moment. "Imani," he said softly, crouching down to her level. She stiffened but didn't turn away. He knew he had to be careful, that any misstep could cause her to retreat. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Her gaze dropped to the floor, and she seemed to wrestle with herself, uncertain whether to trust him. For the first time, she nodded, but it was a hesitant, reluctant gesture. He felt the weight of her silence, a chasm of words left unspoken. "I just want to help," he added, his voice barely a whisper. "If there's anything you need, if something's wrong, you don't have to be alone." She looked up, her eyes swimming with emotions he couldn't fully decipher. Finally, she spoke, her voice a fragile murmur that carried the weight of hidden pain. "Sometimes it's better to be alone." Tom felt his heart twist, the familiar sting of grief resurfacing as he looked at this child who seemed to bear the burdens of an entire world. He wanted to reach out, to hold her hand, to promise her a life free from worry. But he knew it wouldn't be that simple. Whatever she was facing, it was a mountain she had already scaled on her own, night after night. As he watched her turn back to her task, the resolve within him hardened. He wouldn't force her to open up, but he would stay close, watching over her in whatever way he could. He would unravel the mystery around Imani, protect her from whatever shadows followed her. In Part 3, we could explore how Tom's subtle efforts begin to unveil the Imani's situation, revealing a mix of resilience and fragility that draws him closer. Let me know how you'd like to continue this journey. Fractured Pieces. Sheriff Tom Hollis felt as if he were chasing ghosts. The more he looked into Imani's life, the more questions seemed to arise, each one slipping through his fingers just when he thought he was close to an answer. Tonight, he found himself back in front of the rundown apartment building where he had last seen her enter. By day, the building looked even worse than it had in the dark. A sagging roof, peeling paint, and broken windows half covered with cardboard. It was a place where people lived only when they had nowhere else to go. He stepped out of his patrol car and walked up to the front door, the weight of his badge pressing on him as he prepared to dig deeper. As he crossed the threshold, he felt a chill run down his spine. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and old cigarettes. Water stains marred the ceiling, and the faded carpet was so worn in places that the concrete underneath showed through. After a few knocks, a door creaked open, and a gaunt woman with hollow cheeks and tired eyes peeked out. She was hesitant, her gaze darting between Tom's face and the badge pinned to his shirt. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice brittle. Tom introduced himself and explained he was checking in on the residents as part of a community outreach initiative, hoping to get a sense of who lived there and if there were any children around. "Children," she repeated, eyes narrowing as if he had asked a peculiar question. "There's only one kid here that I've seen, a quiet little thing, maybe 8 or 9. Doesn't talk to anyone though. Keeps to herself, always carrying around a backpack full of clothes. She's different." Tom's heart picked up. "That sounds like the one I'm looking for. Do you know anything about her family?" The woman shrugged. "She's got a mother. I think, though I rarely see her, the mom's not around much. Folks say she's dealing with her own mess, you know." She paused, her gaze softening slightly. "Poor girl. It's like she's raising herself." Tom thanked her, and after a few more cautious inquiries, he confirmed Imani did live there, though she was often left alone for days at a time. It wasn't much to go on, but it was enough to ignite a steady flame of concern in his chest. He left the building with a heavy heart, the pieces of Imani's life only half fitting together in his mind. That evening, he returned to the station and pored over reports, scouring through records for any mention of her mother. It was as if she were a ghost herself. No official records, no social services reports, no mention of trouble or assistance. He expanded his search, looking for anything that might explain Imani's circumstances, but the woman seemed almost non-existent. Frustration bubbled up in him as the hours ticked by, the empty screen and silent room amplifying his helplessness. Just as he was about to give up, a single name caught his eye. Evelyn Jones. A few years back, she had been flagged by Child Services for unfit living conditions, but the case had been closed due to lack of follow-up. The details were sparse, but he managed to locate a contact number and dialed it. The phone rang several times before a weary voice answered. "Hello, Ms. Jones. This is Sheriff Tom Hollis from Bridgeton. I'm trying to reach Evelyn Jones regarding her daughter, Imani." There was a long pause, and when she spoke again, her tone was guarded. "Is there a problem, Sheriff?" Tom hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I've been seeing Imani around town, and she seems to be on her own quite a bit. I wanted to check in, make sure everything's all right. Kids her age shouldn't be wandering around alone at all hours, don't you think?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and he could almost feel Evelyn's apprehension seeping through. She's a strong girl. She doesn't need as much supervision as you might think," she replied defensively. "I'm doing the best I can for her." Tom felt a swell of frustration at her dismissive tone, but he pushed it down. "Look, I understand things can be difficult," he said, his voice steady but firm. "But Imani is a child, and from what I've seen, she's shouldering more than any child should. I'd like to know what I can do to help." Silence stretched between them, and Tom was beginning to think she'd hung up when Evelyn finally spoke again, her voice softer, almost resigned. "There's nothing anyone can do, Sheriff. We're fine." The line went dead, leaving Tom staring at the receiver, feeling the echo of her words settle over him like a layer of frost. The next night, Tom was back in his car, watching the laundromat from across the street. He was determined to keep an eye on Imani, even if he couldn't break through her mother's walls. Sure enough, she arrived just after midnight, the same weary look in her eyes as she dragged her bag to her usual spot. As he watched her, he noticed something he hadn't before. Her hands were chapped, the skin raw and cracked. She wore a faintly grim expression, her shoulders tense as she worked. This time, Tom couldn't stay in his car. He crossed the street, his heart pounding as he pushed open the laundromat door. Imani looked up, a flicker of surprise crossing her face, before her expression settled back into guarded neutrality. "Hey, Imani," he said softly, crouching down to her level. "I wanted to see how you were doing. It's not every day you meet someone as responsible as you." Imani looked at him, her eyes unreadable. After a pause, she shrugged. "Just doing my laundry." Tom nodded. "I get that. But I was thinking maybe you could use a hand every now and then." For a moment, she didn't respond. But then, unexpectedly, she let out a long sigh, her shoulders slumping as if under the weight of a silent burden. Her voice was barely audible as she spoke. "I don't need help. I'm fine." But there was a wavering in her voice, a quiet vulnerability she couldn't quite mask. Tom felt a pang of sympathy so intense it almost hurt. "I get that," he said gently. "Sometimes we think it's easier to handle things alone. But it doesn't have to be that way, you know." Imani didn't respond, but she looked down, her fingers tracing patterns on her worn bag, as if searching for something to say. Finally, she whispered, "I don't have anyone else. My mom. She tries, but she's not always around. So I have to be the one who does things." The quiet strength in her words struck him, and he felt his own resolve solidify. "Imani, I know I'm just a stranger to you, but I'd like to help. Maybe we can figure this out together." Imani looked at him, her face a mask of skepticism, but in her eyes, Tom saw a flicker of hope, so faint he could almost convince himself he'd imagined it. She took a breath, as if steeling herself, and finally nodded. "Maybe," she murmured, barely audible. But to Tom, it was a start. He could see the fractured pieces of her world slowly beginning to shift, and he promised himself he wouldn't let her face them alone anymore. In Part 4, we could explore how Tom's involvement deepens and Imani's trust begins to build, leading him to a heart-wrenching realization about her life and the difficult choices he may have to make. Let me know if you'd like to continue. Shadows of Truth. The following days were a quiet game of trust-building between Sheriff Tom Hollis and Imani. Each encounter chipped away at the invisible walls she built around herself, and Tom could see her relaxing, if only slightly. He'd show up at the laundromat, sometimes with a small bag of snacks, other times with stories from his own childhood, the ones about struggle and survival that Imani seemed to listen to intently but never commented on. Bit by bit, her silence softened. One chilly evening, as Tom arrived at the laundromat with 2 hot chocolates in hand, he found Imani waiting. She was staring out the window, her reflection barely visible against the frosty glass. For a moment, she looked like any other child, lost in thought and worry-free. But when she turned to him, her eyes betrayed a depth of sorrow that seemed almost too heavy for someone her age to carry. He handed her a cup, and she took it wordlessly, warming her fingers on the paper. They sat in silence for a while, sipping their drinks. Eventually, Imani broke the quiet with a hesitant question. Do you ever feel like you're the only one who has to fix everything? Tom felt a lump in his throat. He knew this was a fragile moment, a tentative bridge she was building. I think I know that feeling, yeah, he said gently. Sometimes it feels like if you let go for even a second, everything will fall apart. But that's a lot for one person to handle. Shadows of Truth. The following days were a quiet game of trust-building between Sheriff Tom Hollis and Imani. Each encounter chipped away at the invisible walls she built around herself, and Tom could see her relaxing, if only slightly. He'd show up at the laundromat, sometimes with a small bag of snacks, other times with stories from his own childhood, the ones about struggle and survival that Imani seemed to listen to intently but never commented on. Bit by bit, her silence softened. One chilly evening, as Tom arrived at the laundromat with 2 hot chocolates in hand, he found Imani waiting. She was staring out the window, her reflection barely visible against the frosty glass. For a moment, she looked like any other child, lost in thought and worry-free. But when she turned to him, her eyes betrayed a depth of sorrow that seemed almost too heavy for someone her age to carry. He handed her a cup, and she took it wordlessly, warming her fingers on the paper. They sat in silence for a while, sipping their drinks. Eventually, Imani broke the quiet with a hesitant question. Do you ever feel like you're the only one who has to fix everything? Tom felt a lump in his throat. He knew this was a fragile moment, a tentative bridge she was building. I think I know that feeling, yeah, he said gently. Sometimes it feels like if you let go for even a second, everything will fall apart. But that's a lot for one person to handle. Imani nodded, her gaze far away. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but then seemed to think better of it, turning her attention back to the cup in her hands. After a moment, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. I know people think my mom doesn't care about me, but she does. She's just not strong enough sometimes. Tom's heart broke at the understanding in her voice. A child her age shouldn't know what it meant for a parent to be weak, to carry a burden that wasn't hers. He reached out, putting a reassuring hand on her shoulder. I believe you, Imani. Sometimes people have their own battles, and they just can't win them alone. But that doesn't mean you have to fight hers for her. You deserve to have your own life, too. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, but didn't respond. Tom could tell there were layers of secrecy she wasn't ready to share, and he respected that. But he knew he had to help her somehow, so he started investigating more deeply into her mother's life. He wasn't prepared for what he would uncover. After digging into old police reports and medical records, Tom discovered that Evelyn, Imani's mother, had a history of substance abuse and had been in and out of rehabilitation centers for years. The addiction had stolen much from her: her health, her stability, and a chance at being the mother Imani needed. But as he read between the lines, he realized that Evelyn had been trying, even through relapses and failures, to get her life together. Imani had been her one constant, the only person who hadn't given up on her. The thought stirred a strange mix of empathy and frustration in him. One night, Tom decided to check in on Evelyn directly. He found her in a dimly lit motel on the outskirts of town, a place known for its transient visitors and struggling souls. When she opened the door, her eyes were bloodshot, and her hand shook slightly as she held the doorframe. Sheriff Hollis, she said, her voice wary but calm. What brings you here? Tom cleared his throat, trying to keep his tone neutral. I'm here about Imani. She's been She's been spending a lot of time alone, and it's taking a toll on her. I wanted to know if there's anything I can do to help you get back on your feet so you can be there for her." Evelyn's expression hardened, but he saw a flicker of guilt in her eyes. "I'm doing what I can, Sheriff. I'm working on it." "I understand that," Tom replied, keeping his voice steady. "But Imani deserves more than just survival. She needs stability, love, a home where she doesn't have to be the adult. She's a child, Evelyn, and she's running herself ragged trying to hold everything together for you." Evelyn looked away, her face tightening with pain. "I know. You think I don't know that. Every time I fall apart, it's her who suffers. I see it in her eyes. But she's all I have left, Sheriff. I don't want to lose her." Tom felt a surge of frustration. "Then show her that she's not alone in this. Get the help you need, for her sake. I can connect you with people who can provide support. But if things don't change, I might have to step in to protect her." Evelyn's face crumpled, and she hugged herself as if to hold back the weight of her shame. "I know," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I know. But she's stronger than me, Sheriff. I've always known that. I thought maybe I could lean on her just until I got back on my feet. But I've leaned too much, haven't I?" "I understand that," Tom replied, keeping his voice steady. "But Imani deserves more than just survival. She needs stability, love, a home where she doesn't have to be the adult. She's a child, Evelyn, and she's running herself ragged trying to hold everything together for you." Evelyn looked away, her face tightening with pain. "I know. You think I don't know that. Every time I fall apart, it's her who suffers. I see it in her eyes. But she's all I have left, Sheriff. I don't want to lose her." Tom felt a surge of frustration. "Then show her that she's not alone in this. Get the help you need, for her sake. I can connect you with people who can provide support. But if things don't change, I might have to step in to protect her." Evelyn's face crumpled, and she hugged herself as if to hold back the weight of her shame. "I know," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I know. But she's stronger than me, Sheriff. I've always known that. I thought maybe I could lean on her just until I got back on my feet. But I've leaned too much, haven't I?" Tom nodded, his own heart heavy. "It's not too late, Evelyn. But you have to make a choice, for both your sakes." He left her that night with a faint glimmer of hope. Maybe she'd take his words to heart. Maybe not. But either way, he knew he had to be there for Imani. She had shouldered too much already. The long road home. Days turned to weeks, and Sheriff Tom Hollis watched Imani blossom in small, almost imperceptible ways. Her guarded silences gave way to shy smiles, and she seemed lighter, as if the weight of the world was slowly lifting from her shoulders. Tom was cautiously optimistic, but he knew this fragile sense of normalcy could shatter if Evelyn failed to confront her demons. After their conversation at the motel, Tom had provided Evelyn with the contact details for a local rehabilitation center, a place that offered not only treatment but also family counseling and long-term support. It was a lifeline, and Evelyn seemed to grasp it, though Tom had learned not to expect miracles. Change, he knew, was a hard path. He'd seen too many people slip back into old habits after the initial willpower wore thin. Then, one late autumn morning, Tom received a call from the rehab center. Evelyn had checked herself in the night before. She was in a fragile but determined state, the intake counselor reported. There was no guarantee she'd complete the program, but she'd taken the first step. Tom's heart lifted slightly, but he kept his expectations grounded. He knew Evelyn's struggle was far from over, and Imani's journey would be equally challenging. But now, at least there was a glimmer of hope, a test of resilience. With Evelyn in treatment, Imani needed someone to look after her. Tom, who had grown close to her, became her temporary guardian, setting up a spare room in his modest home and working with social services to make the arrangement official. He was more than just a guardian to her now. He had become a steady, unwavering presence in her life, a role he never imagined he'd take on. The adjustment was slow and occasionally rocky. Imani was used to fending for herself, and even the smallest gestures of kindness unsettled her. She was wary of promises, and Tom could see why. Her mother had likely made promises she hadn't been able to keep, words that eventually became hollow to Imani. One night, as they sat on the porch, Imani finally voiced her worries. "What if she doesn't get better?" she asked, her voice a fragile thread of doubt. Tom looked at her, his face somber. He didn't want to offer empty assurances. "That's a real possibility," he admitted. "But no matter what happens with your mom, I want you to know that you'll always have a place with me. You're not alone, Imani, and you don't have to carry all this by yourself." Imani looked down, blinking back tears. She was silent for a long moment before she whispered, "I don't even know how to stop." Tom reached over, gently squeezing her hand. "That's okay. You've been carrying so much for so long, it's going to take time to let go. But I'll be here to help, whenever you're ready." Gradually, Tom began introducing her to a routine that involved school, meals together, and evenings filled with quiet conversations or shared activities. He made an effort to keep things steady, predictable, and safe. Little by little, Imani began to trust this new rhythm, a visit to the past. As Evelyn worked her way through treatment, she wrote letters to Imani, each one filled with apologies, promises, and pleas for forgiveness. Imani read them quietly, her expression unreadable. Tom didn't press her, but he noticed the way her eyes lingered on certain phrases, as though searching for something deeper, something she hadn't found yet. A few weeks later, Evelyn requested a visit with Imani at the rehab center. When Tom told Imani about the visit, her face was a mix of excitement and dread. She wanted to see her mother, she always would, but Tom sensed her fear. What if Evelyn wasn't truly ready to change? What if this was just another false start? The day of the visit arrived, and Tom drove her to the center, letting her squeeze his hand in the car as they neared the facility. Imani's face was tight, her eyes clouded with anxiety. But when she spotted her mother waiting in the small visiting room, her guarded expression softened. Evelyn looked healthier than Imani had seen her in years. She was thin, almost frail, but her eyes were clearer, her gaze steady. She reached out for Imani with trembling hands, pulling her daughter into a tight embrace. Imani stood still, unsure, before finally allowing herself to lean into her mother's arms. The moment felt fragile, like a dream that could dissolve at any second. "I'm so sorry, baby," Evelyn whispered. "I know I've hurt you. I know I've let you down over and over again. But I want to change, for you, for me. I know it's going to take time. But I'm here, and I'm going to keep trying." Imani didn't reply, but Tom noticed her small hands clenching her mother's, holding on as if to ground herself in this moment. He knew trust wouldn't come easily, not after years of instability, but perhaps this was a start. Perhaps this time, Evelyn would follow through. As they left, Imani was quiet, processing the visit in her own way. Tom gave her space, only squeezing her shoulder as a silent reminder that he was there for her, no matter what came next. A new chapter. Months passed, and Evelyn continued her treatment, attending support groups and working with counselors. She sent Imani letters regularly, slowly rebuilding a relationship through the small, simple act of writing. Imani grew used to her life with Tom, but the specter of her mother's absence lingered. She was learning to live with hope and hesitation in equal measure. One evening, while they were working on a jigsaw puzzle together, a new tradition Tom had introduced, Imani looked up, breaking the silence. "Do you think she'll come home someday?" Tom paused, thinking carefully. "I think she's working towards it. But in the meantime, you have a home here. You're safe and you're loved. Whatever happens with your mom, I want you to know that." Imani nodded, her expression unreadable. But for the first time, Tom saw something new in her gaze, a glimmer of peace. She was finally letting herself feel secure in the here and now, rather than waiting on a promise of a future that might never come. A promise kept. Nearly a year after she first entered treatment, Evelyn returned to town. She had completed her program and found a job at a nearby diner. She was sober, stable, and determined to rebuild her life. She asked to meet with Tom and Imani, explaining that she wanted to ease back into her daughter's life without disrupting the hard-won stability Imani had found with Tom. When they met, Evelyn looked different, older, wiser, and marked by the battles she'd fought within herself. She reached out to Imani, holding her hand with both of her own. "I know I've said this before, but I'm here for you, baby. This time, for real. And I know it'll take time to prove that." Imani, still holding onto her mother's hand, looked at Tom, her eyes searching. Tom gave her a nod of encouragement, his heart swelling with pride for this resilient young girl who had endured so much. He knew that whatever she chose, it would be her choice, made from a place of strength and healing. Over the months that followed, Imani spent weekends with her mother, easing into a new rhythm, one that involved both the steady love she'd found with Tom and the rekindled bond with her mother. Slowly, a family began to form, not perfect, not conventional, but one rooted in resilience, forgiveness, and the quiet courage it took to keep trying, no matter the setbacks. Tom watched as Imani navigated this new chapter, his own heart both heavy and hopeful. He knew he would always be part of her life, her protector and friend. And as he saw the light in Imani's eyes grow brighter with each passing day, he knew that despite the hardships and the heartaches, they had all found their way home. Let me know if you'd like to explore a specific epilogue, or if there are further details you'd like to add to the conclusion. New beginnings, old wounds. Months after her mother's return, Imani found herself caught between the stability of life with Sheriff Tom and the fragile hope of reuniting with Evelyn. Though Evelyn had made incredible strides, Imani could sense the weight her mother carried, and with each passing day, her own fears returned in whispers. What if her mother's sobriety slipped? What if their life together fell apart again? The small town was a strange new world for Evelyn, who was piecing her life back together one humble shift at a time at the local diner. Her days were spent serving coffee and cleaning tables, quiet but deeply humbling work, far removed from the chaos she once knew. She avoided the old haunts, the bars, the places that reminded her of her darkest days. At first, she felt invisible, caught in a routine that seemed to stretch endlessly. But with each clean plate and refilled cup, Evelyn found herself stronger, more in control. Tom noticed Evelyn's resilience, as well as her unspoken doubts. He kept his distance while still extending a hand when needed. And though Imani had settled into life with Tom, it was clear that a part of her was tethered to her mother, her loyalty unwavering. So, on a chilly autumn day, Tom made a decision, one that he hoped would give Evelyn a chance to truly reconnect with her daughter without jeopardizing Imani's newfound stability. The joint custody arrangement. Tom suggested a joint custody arrangement, allowing Evelyn to have more time with Imani while ensuring a structured, supportive environment. At first, Evelyn balked at the suggestion. She wanted her daughter with her full time, to prove that she could be the mother Imani deserved. But after several conversations with both Tom and her support counselor, Evelyn realized that this arrangement might give her the stability she needed to continue her recovery. For Imani, the change was both thrilling and nerve-wracking. She loved her mother deeply and wanted to believe that this time would be different. But her heart was wary, scared from years of disappointment. She expressed her fears to Tom in a quiet moment one evening. "What if it all goes wrong again? What if I end up back where I started?" Tom looked her in the eye, his voice firm yet gentle. "We're not going to let that happen, Imani. And you don't have to do this alone. No matter what, I'll always be here for you." Rebuilding a bond. Over the weeks that followed, Imani and Evelyn worked to rebuild their relationship, this time with a foundation rooted in open communication. They had dinners together, spent afternoons baking or watching movies, and even took long walks in the countryside, talking about everything and nothing. Evelyn found herself sharing her past with a painful honesty, showing Imani the struggle she had faced, rather than hiding it behind silence. These conversations weren't easy, but they were necessary. Imani listened, her gaze steady, but her heart aching with a mixture of compassion and sadness. It was difficult to reconcile the mother she now knew with the memories of her past, but in these moments, Imani began to understand that her mother's love had always been there, buried beneath the weight of addiction. One Sunday afternoon, while sorting through old family photos, Evelyn came across a picture of her and Imani from years ago. They were at the park, Imani perched on her mother's shoulders, both of them laughing, carefree and innocent. Evelyn's hands trembled as she held the photograph, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, baby," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I wish I could go back and change it all." Imani reached out, placing her hand on her mother's. "We can't change the past," she said softly, surprising herself with the wisdom in her own words. "But we can keep going forward." In that moment, a quiet understanding passed between them. Evelyn knew that while she could never erase the pain she'd caused, she could work every day to prove that she was worthy of her daughter's forgiveness and trust. Tom's role in the background. While Evelyn and Imani grew closer, Tom remained a constant figure in Imani's life. He attended her school events, drove her to soccer practice, and kept the same open, welcoming home for her as before. He and Evelyn had a complicated relationship, built on mutual respect and a shared love for Imani. They were both aware of the delicate balance they had created, one that allowed Imani to feel safe and supported, without forcing her to choose between them. In the quiet moments, Tom often reflected on his role in Imani's life. He had never intended to become a father figure, but Imani had changed him. She had brought light into his life in ways he hadn't anticipated, teaching him about resilience, loyalty, and the power of unconditional support. And though he knew that Imani's bond with her mother was irreplaceable, he found comfort in the knowledge that he could be her safe harbor whenever she needed it. A setback and a test of will. While Evelyn and Imani grew closer, Tom remained a constant figure in Imani's life. He attended her school events, drove her to soccer practice, and kept the same open, welcoming home for her as before. He and Evelyn had a complicated relationship, built on mutual respect and a shared love for Imani. They were both aware of the delicate balance they had created, one that allowed Imani to feel safe and supported, without forcing her to choose between them. In the quiet moments, Tom often reflected on his role in Imani's life. He had never intended to become a father figure, but Imani had changed him. She had brought light into his life in ways he hadn't anticipated, teaching him about resilience, loyalty, and the power of unconditional support. And though he knew that Imani's bond with her mother was irreplaceable, he found comfort in the knowledge that he could be her safe harbor whenever she needed it. A setback and a test of will.